Berlin, May 2, 1945. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and plaster dust. A dull gray sky hung over the city, broken only by the skeletal remains of apartment blocks that once held laughter, coffee cups, and radios humming symphonies. Now, every window was a hollow eye socket staring at defeat. Sergeant Daniel Carter moved slowly through the ruins near the Reichstag, his boots crunching over glass and shell casings. The war was over, or so they said, but Berlin didn't know how to stop dying. Somewhere, a piano string twanged in the wind, a ghostly sound, like the city trying to remember music. He had seen destruction before, in France, in Belgium, in the Ardennes where the forests burned green and black. But this was different. This was annihilation with a human face. Every alley whispered of starvation. Every corner hid a shadow too weak to stand. The posters of Hitler that once screamed victory now hung in tatters, faces half-burned, eyes staring into nothing. Carter adjusted the strap of his rifle, though he no longer needed to. The enemy had vanished, leaving only survivors. He passed a row of women standing silently beside the shell of a bakery. They weren't begging required hope. They were just waiting for something, anything, to happen that wasn't hunger. A small boy, no older than 7, held a tin cup to a broken hydrant, catching the brown trickle that came out. One of the women glared at Carter as he passed. She spat weakly in his direction. "Americaner," she muttered. Her voice cracked but full of hatred. He didn't blame her. To her, he was one more uniformed stranger walking through what used to be her life. "Sergeant," someone called behind him. Private Jenkins, his radio man, jogged up, sweat streaked with grime. "Captain says to sweep South Block. They're finding stragglers. Civilians, too. Orders are no fraternization." "Yeah," Carter muttered, eyes still on the women. "No fraternization." He turned into an alley where the air smelled of rot and rain. There, under a shattered doorway, he saw her. A woman, maybe mid-20s, hair once blonde but now the color of soot. Her dress was torn, her arms wrapped around a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. The child's eyes were wide and glassy, staring at Carter like he was both monster and miracle. The woman didn't move when he approached. Her lips trembled as she whispered in German, "Bit. Not the child." He lowered his weapon slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't understand, but she could read the tone. Her shoulders loosened a fraction. He looked around, no Soviets yet, though their presence was always near, like thunder behind the hills. He took off his canteen and held it out. "Water," he said, gesturing. The woman hesitated, then reached out. Her fingers brushed his glove. The contact was electric. Not romantic, just real, 2 human beings who had run out of hate. The child drank first, coughing as she swallowed too fast. Then the woman drank, eyes closing, her throat moving like she hadn't tasted water in days. Behind them, Jenkins called, "Sergeant, we got to move." Carter turned slightly. "Give me a minute." The woman's name was scrawled in faint thread on her coat collar. "Weiss." He pointed at it. "Anna?" She nodded faintly. He pointed at the child. "Name?" "Liesel," she whispered, barely audible. "Anna. Liesel," he repeated, as if naming them might protect them from whatever ghosts still wandered these ruins. He heard footsteps behind him, other soldiers coming. He knew what they'd see. A U.S. sergeant sharing water with a German civilian, the kind they'd been warned about, the kind the Soviets called spoils of war. His orders were clear: no contact, no exceptions. But something in the way Anna clutched her daughter, like she expected the world to end again any second, made the rule feel obscene. He crouched closer and said quietly, "You can't stay here. The Russians are sweeping east to west." He pointed toward the American sector. "Come with me." Her eyes darted to the alley mouth, where boot steps echoed closer. She didn't move. He said again, softer this time, "Come with me." She stared at him like she was trying to decide whether mercy was real. Then she nodded once. Slowly, she stood, clutching Liesel to her chest. Carter motioned for them to follow. He led them through back alleys thick with smoke and broken glass, past the bodies of soldiers who hadn't yet been collected, past the remains of a tram car still on its tracks, half buried in debris. Every sound was amplified. The distant rumble of trucks, the flutter of a torn curtain, the child's soft whimper. They reached a collapsed archway that led to what used to be a school basement. Carter guided them down, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark. Inside were the remains of chalkboards and desks, now a makeshift shelter for a handful of refugees too scared to surface. The air was damp, full of mildew and despair. He turned to Anna. "Stay here for now. I'll come back." She didn't understand the words, but she caught the tone. Promise mixed with command. She nodded slowly, eyes wide and hollow. Liesel clung to her mother's coat, silent as a shadow. Carter stepped back into the street. The world above felt heavier now. He looked toward the blackened skyline. The Reichstag dome twisted, the Brandenburg Gate scarred. The American flag fluttered in the distance, absurdly clean against the ash. He thought about the war's beginning. The speeches about freedom, the posters promising victory, the faces of boys who never came home. And now, here he was, standing in the Empire's graveyard, trying to save a woman he was ordered to ignore. The irony was suffocating. "Sergeant!" Jenkins barked from down the street. "What the hell you doing down there?" Carter didn't answer right away. He just looked at the sky. A strange, pale dawn creeping over Berlin. He thought of the words his chaplain once said before the Ardennes offensive. "In war, victory is just the right to carry the guilt longer." He whispered it to himself. "Yeah, I guess so." Then he turned, walking toward his unit, his rifle hanging loose, his mind replaying the look in Anna's eyes, that fragile mixture of terror and belief. He didn't know why he had told her to follow him. Maybe because, after all the blood and orders and medals, he just wanted to feel human again. The next day, Berlin would surrender completely. But that night, in the cellar beneath the ruins, a German mother and her daughter waited in silence, trusting the word of a stranger in a foreign uniform. And somewhere above them, amid the smoke and shattered glass, Sergeant Daniel Carter repeated the words that had already broken every rule he was sworn to follow. "Come with me." 3 lines lingered in the silence of Berlin. He came as a conqueror but stayed as a savior. Berlin had fallen. Humanity hadn't. One order defied the war itself. The nights in Berlin had stopped being nights. There was no true darkness, only a gray half-light that hung in the air like smoke that refused to die. Fires still burned in pockets across the city, their glow reflecting off puddles of rain and blood. In the basement of the ruined school, Anna Weiss huddled with her daughter beneath a torn army blanket. The faint beam of a flashlight swept across the cracked ceiling above them. It was Daniel Carter, returning quietly, one hand on his rifle, the other carrying a small ration tin. He set it down and whispered, "It's not much." The sound of his voice startled her. She had begun to think he might not come back. His uniform looked darker than before, wet from the mist outside, mud smeared on his sleeves. He opened the tin bread, a few pieces of canned meat, a chocolate bar broken in half. When he handed it over, her hands trembled as she took it. She divided it carefully, half for Liesel, half for herself, saving a crumb for later the way starving people do. Carter sat down against the wall, helmet beside him, the flicker of the candle casting long shadows across his face. He watched the mother and daughter eat in silence. Somewhere above them, boots echoed faintly, American soldiers on patrol. He wasn't supposed to be here. Fraternization orders were clear. Any soldier found assisting or concealing German civilians could face immediate court-martial. But every time he looked at the child's hollow cheeks, the rule felt like another form of cruelty. "You'll get yourself shot," Jenkins had warned that afternoon. "You start saving one, they'll all come crawling." "Maybe they should," Carter had replied. Now, in the damp cellar, he tried to explain through gestures. He pointed toward the street and shook his head. "Russians." Then he pointed to himself and placed a finger to his lips. "Quiet." Anna nodded. She didn't need translation to understand. Everyone in Berlin knew what the Russians were doing. The city was full of whispers, of vengeance, of women dragged from cellars, of bodies left in stairwells. When Carter first entered Berlin, he'd dismissed the stories as enemy propaganda. But 2 days ago, they had found a family of 4 in a bombed apartment, huddled together in death. The youngest girl had a ribbon still tied in her hair. That image would never leave him. He looked at Anna now, pale, exhausted, but alive. "You need to move soon," he said softly, though he knew she couldn't grasp the words. "Can't stay here forever." Her eyes flickered to the door. She whispered something in German. He caught only one word: angst, fear. It was universal enough. He gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." For the next few days he came when he could, always at night, always alone. He brought rations, sometimes a bit of medicine, once even a blanket he'd borrowed from an American field truck. Anna started to understand fragments of English. She learned his name. He learned hers properly: Anna Weiss from Friedrichshain, widow of a soldier named Otto who had died at Stalingrad. "Stalingrad," she said one evening, the word catching in her throat. "Vili Manor tot. Many men dead." Carter didn't answer. He remembered his own friends in the Ardennes. Frost, Donnelly, Ruiz, all gone before Christmas. Different sides, same graveyards. They built a fragile rhythm. Liesel began to smile again, faintly, when Carter entered. She would tug at his sleeve and whisper "chocolate," and he'd grin, handing over a small piece, pretending to be stern. "Only if you eat the bread first," he'd say, and Anna, not understanding the words, still smiled at the tone. But danger grew closer every day. Soviet patrols were pushing west, scavenging through abandoned buildings, searching for anything, or anyone, left behind. One night, as Carter slipped through a rubble-strewn alley, he froze. Voices, heavy accents, slurred with drink. Russian. He ducked behind the frame of a burned-out truck and waited. 2 soldiers passed, laughing, one waving a bottle. They didn't see him. The moment they were gone, he moved faster, heart hammering. When he reached the cellar, Anna was waiting near the door, listening. She saw the tension in his face before he spoke. He shut the door and whispered, "You have to leave, now." She didn't understand. He mimed marching boots, pointed east, then drew a line west with his hand. "Americans," he said, then pointed east again. "Russians. Bad." Her expression hardened with understanding. "If we go, they shoot?" He hesitated. "If you stay, they'll do worse." She held Liesel closer. "Where?" He thought of the American checkpoint 2 miles away, near the Tiergarten, where patrols were still setting up a communications post. Getting there would mean crossing open ground patrolled by both armies, past wrecked tanks and collapsed bridges. But there was no choice anymore. He pulled his map from his jacket, spreading it on the ground. By candlelight, he traced a path with his finger. "Here," he said, pointing. "We go here." She watched him silently, her face pale in the flickering light. Then, after a long pause, she said the words he'd taught her. "Come with me." He blinked, surprised. Then he smiled faintly. "No," he corrected gently. "I say that." The next night, rain fell in thin, cold sheets. Carter waited until his patrol finished their rounds, then slipped away under the cover of darkness. He carried no rifle this time, too loud, too visible. Just a pistol and a flashlight. When he reached the cellar, Anna and Liesel were already waiting, bundled in gray coats. Anna held a small satchel, all she had left of her life. Inside, he later learned, were 2 items: a photograph of Otto and a cracked porcelain doll with no face. He gave her a signal, 2 fingers to his lips, then to the door. Silence. They moved out into the night. The streets were unrecognizable now. A maze of rubble, shattered glass glinting in puddles. In the distance, artillery flashed like lightning. They slipped through courtyards where cats prowled for rats, through alleys that smelled of ash and sewage. Every step echoed like gunfire. Twice they ducked behind walls as searchlights swept the ruins. At one intersection, they heard shouting. A group of men, Russian voices again, laughing, singing drunkenly. Carter froze, pressed Anna back against the wall. He could feel her heartbeat hammering through her coat. He whispered, "Quiet." Though she was already holding her breath, Liesel's small hand clutched his sleeve. The Russians passed without seeing them. When they finally reached the Tiergarten, dawn was bleeding into the sky. The once beautiful park was now a wasteland, burned trees, craters, the carcasses of tanks left like monuments to madness. They crawled through the mud, keeping low. Carter's uniform was soaked. Anna's shoes were torn. The child whimpered once, and he covered her mouth gently. "Almost there," he murmured. They reached an old stone bridge that crossed a narrow canal. The water below was black with oil. On the far side, an American flag hung limp from a half-collapsed radio tower. Safety was a few hundred yards away. Then came the sound, engines. Soviet trucks approaching from the east. Carter grabbed Anna's hand. "Run!" They sprinted across the bridge as the trucks screeched to a halt. Shouts in Russian behind them, gunfire cracking through the morning air. Bullets struck the stone railings, sending shards flying. Anna stumbled. He pulled her up. "Keep going," he yelled. Liesel cried out, but they didn't stop. When they reached the far side, American soldiers shouted, weapons raised. Carter threw up his hands and shouted, "Friendly! Friendly!" His voice echoed through the ruins. The gunfire stopped. He turned to Anna, breathing hard, mud streaked on his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The war, the orders, the rules, none of it mattered anymore. He looked at her and whispered the words again, softer than before, as if sealing a promise between two broken worlds. "Come with me." Outside, Berlin burned on. Inside that fragile moment, humanity still lived. The morning sun over Berlin was weak and colorless, spilling through the smoke like a tired ghost. The city looked less like a capital and more like a graveyard of nations. Tanks lay twisted in intersections, their treads buried in dust. The smell of burnt fuel, brick, and flesh blended into something that could never be forgotten. Sergeant Daniel Carter stood on the far side of the canal, chest heaving, heart pounding, mud caked on his uniform. Behind him, Anna Weiss clutched her daughter Liesel, both trembling but alive. The American checkpoint loomed just ahead, a makeshift barrier of sandbags and barbed wire under the shattered statue of a horseman. For a moment it seemed they had made it. "Hold it!" shouted a voice. Several rifles aimed their way. Carter raised his hands, breath visible in the cold morning air. U.S. Army. Sergeant Daniel Carter, 45th Infantry Division. A lieutenant stepped forward, his helmet cocked to one side, his uniform too clean to belong to a man who'd seen real fighting. "What the hell is this, Sergeant?" He pointed his carbine toward Anna and Liesel. "You bringing prisoners?" Carter hesitated. "Civilians, non-combatants. I found them hiding from the Soviets." The lieutenant frowned. "You know the orders. All German civilians are to be processed by the Soviet sector east of the river. You're out of line." "She's got a kid," Carter said, stepping slightly in front of them. "You send them back. They won't make it an hour." "That's not your problem, Sergeant." Something cold shifted in Carter's gut. He'd fought through 3 campaigns, watched friends die for a cause they said was freedom. Now that freedom stood behind barbed wire, divided by flags. "With respect, sir," he said, voice steady. "I think it is my problem." The lieutenant's jaw clenched. For a moment, Carter thought he might draw his weapon. But then the man sighed, waving them through. "You didn't see me. Get them out of here before command hears about this." Carter nodded once in thanks. He motioned for Anna and Liesel to follow, leading them toward an abandoned supply tent near the edge of the checkpoint. The canvas flapped in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of rust and oil. He found them a place to sit, handed over another ration tin, and poured water into a dented canteen cup. Anna stared at him, eyes wide, unsure if this was safety or another kind of trap. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." But safety was an illusion. Beyond the river, Soviet troops were already occupying half the city. Reports spread fast. Mass assaults, revenge killings, forced deportations. Every street seemed to belong to someone different. Even the air felt divided. The Allies had won, but the victory had fractured into suspicion. Berlin wasn't liberated. It was claimed. Days passed in uneasy quiet. Carter managed to convince his commanding officer that the woman and child were interpreters for field medical operations. It was a lie, but an effective one. Anna cleaned bandages, boiled water, and learned to say English words like thank you and sorry. Liesel played near the tents, her laughter, small and uncertain, cutting through the dead air like a bird returning to a battlefield. The men joked about Carter's pet project. Some teased him, others warned him. "Careful, Sarge," one said. "You start caring, you start losing the edge that keeps you alive." He didn't argue. He just looked toward the skyline where the Reichstag still stood in ruins, its dome a gaping wound. The war had demanded monsters, and now those monsters didn't know how to be men again. But in the small acts, a shared meal, a warm blanket, a smile from a child, he began to feel the edge dull. Maybe that was the point. At night, he walked the perimeter, smoking quietly, watching the glow of distant fires. Anna would sometimes join him, her English improving bit by bit. "You from America?" she asked one night. He nodded. "Kansas. Small town. Nothing like this." She looked toward the dark horizon. "Before, we think America is dream. Good food, music, big cars." He smiled faintly. "We have all that. Still feels small sometimes." She hesitated, then whispered, "Why help us?" Carter didn't answer right away. He exhaled smoke and said, "Because someone should have helped my brother in France. No one did." Anna looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Danke." Their fragile peace didn't last. A week later, Soviet command officers arrived to inspect the sector border. One of them, a major with a scar running down his cheek, noticed Anna in the tent. His eyes narrowed. "German woman," he muttered in broken English. "She belong east. Our zone." Carter stepped forward. "She's a civilian aid worker attached to our unit." The Russian smirked. "Pretty aid worker. You keep trophies now, Sergeant." Carter's fist clenched, but he kept his voice even. "She's under American protection." The Russian shrugged, then leaned closer, his breath reeking of vodka. "War is over, American. Protection is finished." He turned to leave, laughing. That night, Carter knew they had to move again. He found Anna sitting outside the tent, moonlight on her face. "We can't stay," he said. "They'll come back." She looked tired, older than her years. "Always running." "Just a little longer," he said. By dawn, they were gone again. He led them west, past columns of refugees, trucks full of soldiers, and the sound of hammers as new borders were built out of ruins. They crossed fields where tanks had once burned, now silent except for the wind. At a checkpoint near Potsdam, Carter flashed forged papers declaring them displaced persons bound for an American refugee camp. The guard barely looked twice. As they passed through, Anna squeezed his hand, a small, instinctive gesture that said more than words could. They didn't look back. When they reached the camp, hundreds of displaced civilians moved like ghosts through the fences. Polish, Czech, Hungarian, and German. Faces without homes, voices without nations. Carter found an empty corner of a barracks building and made it theirs. Life in the camp was a strange kind of rebirth. Food was rationed, disease common, but at least there were no bombs, no soldiers dragging people from cellars. Anna began helping in the infirmary again, translating when needed. Liesel started drawing in the dirt outside with a stick, sketching flowers that hadn't grown in Berlin for years. Carter sometimes caught himself wondering how it had all come to this. How a man trained to destroy had become the guardian of two lives the world had written off as enemies. The war had flipped everything. Victors turned into caretakers, enemies into family. In late summer, news arrived Japan had surrendered. The entire camp erupted in cautious celebration. Soldiers shouted, music played from a broken radio, and someone passed around a bottle. The war, the real war, was over at last. But as fireworks cracked in the distance, Carter noticed Anna watching quietly from the shadows, holding Liesel close. He walked over. "It's done," he said softly. "No more fighting." She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the flicker of light. "War never done," she said in broken English. "It stay here." She touched her chest. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, it does." That night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Carter stood outside their barracks, staring at the horizon. The first light of dawn glowed faintly, turning the ruins of Berlin into silhouettes against a silver sky. He realized something that chilled him. The war might have ended, but the divisions it carved would last lifetimes. The city would be split, the nations divided, and the people, like Anna, caught in between. He turned back inside. Anna and Liesel slept peacefully for the first time in months. He whispered into the still air, almost to himself, "You're safe now. I'll make sure of it." Outside, the wind moved through the camp, rattling the fences like quiet applause, as if the ghosts of Berlin were watching, waiting, wondering how mercy had survived where empires had fallen. Autumn came slow to Berlin that year, though no one felt like calling it autumn. The air smelled of coal smoke and new construction, of bread lines and wet stone. The city was being divided piece by piece, flags planted where dreams used to stand. The Americans rebuilt the West, the Soviets hardened the East, and between them, families tried to remember what it meant to live. For Sergeant Daniel Carter, now just Mr. Carter, the war had become a ghost that followed him even in peace. He stayed behind for occupation duty, assigned to logistics, counting crates and issuing supplies, a strange fate for a man who had once charged across Europe with a rifle. Every morning, he passed through streets where the bricks still bore the fingerprints of war. And every morning, he looked for Anna and Liesel. He found them again in the field hospital by the river. Anna wore a nurse's uniform now, her hair tied back, her face a little fuller from steady meals. She greeted him with that careful half-smile, the kind that comes only from people who have learned not to expect good news. Liesel ran up first, holding a small paper dove she'd folded from a medical form. "Look," she said proudly. Her English was better now, her laughter clearer. For the first time, Carter allowed himself to believe that something had survived the fire. In the months that followed, Berlin's wounds began to scar over. Markets reopened, churches rang their bells again, and Allied patrols no longer carried their rifles at the ready. Yet beneath it all was an invisible tension, a Cold War already being born. You could feel it in the way people stopped speaking when Soviet officers walked by, or in the way American soldiers stared at the red flags fluttering across the spree. But inside the hospital's small courtyard, the world felt simpler. Laughter, bread, music from a battered gramophone. Life was returning, fragile but determined. When Carter's tour ended, he was given a choice: go home or re-enlist. He filled out the papers to leave. He had done his duty. Yet as he looked out at the smoking skyline one last time, he realized something strange. Home wasn't calling. He'd seen Kansas in the back of his mind for years, but it felt smaller now, too clean, too quiet for the man war had made him. On his last day in Berlin, he went to say goodbye. Anna stood by the ward's doorway, the afternoon sun spilling through broken windows, catching the dust like snowfall. "You go America?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded. "Ship leaves tomorrow." She looked down, her hands folding the edge of her apron. "America is far." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, feels like another planet." Liesel ran to him, clutching a drawing of 3 stick figures. One tall, one with long hair, one small with a yellow sun above them. She pressed it into his hand. "You mama me," she said proudly. Something caught in his throat. He knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's beautiful," he said. She didn't need to understand the words. She felt the warmth in his voice. Anna stood silent, watching. When he rose, he hesitated, then said quietly, "You could come with me." Her eyes lifted sharply. "You mean?" He nodded. "There's a program. Displaced families. Sponsors in the States. I can help." For a long moment she said nothing. Outside, a bell tolled across the river, counting the hours of a world being rebuilt. Finally, she whispered, "Come with me. You said that before. In ruins. He looked down, remembering that night, the smoke, the fear, the trembling hand that had taken his. I meant it then, he said softly. I mean it now. It took months of paperwork, questions, interviews. Bureaucracy tried to crush what compassion had built, but persistence won. By the spring of 1946, Anna Weiss and her daughter were listed among approved civilian dependents. On the day they boarded the ship in Bremerhaven, the sea was calm, gray as steel. Liesel leaned over the railing, her hair whipping in the wind. Anna stood beside Daniel, her hand finding his. You still sure? He asked quietly. She smiled faintly. America is far, but you are here. The ship groaned as it left the harbor, its engines thudding like a slow heartbeat. Berlin disappeared into the mist. A city that had once been the center of the world, now shrinking into memory. Carter watched until it was gone, until the horizon swallowed the last trace of smoke. In New York, they arrived among thousands. The harbor smelled of salt and oil and possibility. Crowds shouted in every language. Children waved at soldiers. When Carter stepped onto American soil again, he expected to feel triumph. Instead, he felt weight, the kind you carry after burying too many ghosts. They settled in a small town outside Chicago. Work came easy enough for him, warehouse labor, then construction. Anna volunteered at a clinic, her English improving every week. Liesel started school, her laughter returning in full. They lived simply. Rented rooms, second-hand furniture, Sunday dinners with the radio humming softly in the background. Yet every so often, a plane passing overhead made them both fall silent, as if waiting for bombs that would never come. One winter evening, snow fell outside their window. Carter sat at the table, polishing a photograph, the one taken in Berlin of the hospital courtyard. Anna poured coffee, her fingers brushing his. You still dream? She asked. Every night, he said quietly. Sometimes it's the Ardennes, sometimes Berlin, sometimes just noise. She nodded. Me too, but now less. He smiled faintly. That's something. Years passed. The world changed again. Germany split in two. The Iron Curtain descended. New wars started, smaller but endless. Yet in a quiet suburb halfway across the ocean, a man and a woman who were once enemies built a life together. They married quietly in 1948. No church, no uniforms, just a courthouse clerk and a promise. On the certificate under place of birth, hers still read Berlin. But when asked for her nationality, she hesitated before saying softly, American. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch and talk about the past, in half English, half German, like two survivors translating life itself. Once, Liesel asked, Mama, what did Daddy say when he first met you? Anna smiled, eyes distant. He said, come with me. Liesel laughed. That's it. That was enough, Anna said. Years later, long after Carter's hair had gone gray, a letter arrived from a historian writing a book on post-war Berlin. It asked for first-hand accounts of soldiers and civilians who had crossed paths in those final days. Carter never replied. Instead, he wrote one line on the back of the envelope and left it on his desk. The war ended in 1945, but the fight to stay human never does. When he died, Anna found it and kept it folded in her prayer book. She never remarried. She told Liesel that kindness had saved them when bullets couldn't. And whenever she walked past the harbor where ships left for faraway places, she would whisper the same words he once did, the words that had carried her from hell to hope. Come with me. The phrase, once an act of rebellion, became a symbol of faith, proof that compassion could defy orders, borders, and history itself. It wasn't about rescue anymore. It was about belief that even in the ruins of the worst century humanity had ever known, two people had chosen mercy over hate. Berlin rebuilt itself, its skyline rising from ashes, its walls falling and rising again. Time turned enemies into neighbors, and neighbors into friends. But somewhere, between memory and myth, a soldier's quiet command still echoed through the rubble. A whisper that outlasted empires. Would you have done the same? Would you have risked everything for someone you were taught to hate, when mercy itself was forbidden?